Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 107 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by Mark Pellegrino. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. So today we're talking about a difficult topic. People suffering is never something that you want, certainly not as a starting point. And the Palestinian people, we've been hearing for forever, basically, for many, many years about how they're suffering and how, of course, it's Israel's fault. So let's start by looking back at how far back do we need to go to see a time where Palestinians were not suffering, and Daniel has a clip of that to show us.
السيارة صار لونها أبيض كتير هيك.
We get the point. So this is, of course, from October 7th, Palestinians in Gaza celebrating because they had just heard the news. Many Israelis had been slaughtered in their own homes at a music festival. Many had been raped. Many had been, tortured to death in the worst possible ways. Uh, Many hostages have been taken. Many dead bodies, people who have been killed, soldiers who have been killed, have been taken back. You see, there's videos that, of course, we're not going to share, Palestinians stomping on the bodies. So this was a day where Palestinians clearly were not suffering, at least the ones in Gaza were very much celebrating, which brings us to this point today. We're talking about a war that was started by Israel's enemies, by Israel's neighbors, who, from day one, from before Israel was even established. And the Palestinians are the front line of that war, and they are seemingly, at least from those videos, happy to be that front line. So when we think about Palestinian suffering, Mark, what is the context in which you think we should look at this?
I'm glad you gave me the interesting question. We have to look at it in the context of the vast majority of them support a murderous genocidal regime. They support murdering Jews. You don't have to search very hard to find children emulating martyrdom, children saying that they want to grow up to stab Jews, run over Jews. Um, and so you have to deal with it from the context of this is a genocidal ideology that has infected an entire culture. It's a pathological culture at this point from years and years and years and years of indoctrination. And that it is not just Hamas that we are at war with, but the ideology that animates the Palestinian people. Now, there may be a few people in there who don't agree with the ideology and can't get out. That doesn't matter until you destroy the ideology and the Palestinian people completely capitulate. They completely renounce this ideology of murdering Jews. Then they are the enemy. And the suffering that they're experiencing is their fault. Why? Because they breached the border in Gaza. They stepped over that border and decided to murder, rape, mutilate, and kidnap Jews. So when you're on the beach with your plastic tent over you and you're crying because it's raining and it's cold and you have no home, blame yourself. And if you aren't to blame because you actually hate Hamas, either fight Hamas or blame Hamas. Don't blame Israel for defending itself. They are the innocent ones here.
Um, Yeah, and you mentioned how, children are indoctrinated. We've seen videos on this channel. We've shown videos of Palestinian children saying what they're being taught in schools, saying how their goal, singing songs about killing Jews. And this, by the way, is, as we've mentioned frequently on this channel, funded by the West, funded by American and British taxpayers. So that is the education system that led the Palestinians to the point where they would even do what they did on October 7th. And again, it was Hamas. Hamas planned it. Hamas, to carry it out. And
Yes,
then
can
Palestinians.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I just have to add on to this. I'm sorry to interrupt your flow, but there's 250 miles of tunnels under Gaza. You don't get those that you don't hide the evidence for building that stuff without massive complicity within the civilian population. People poo-pooed the ideas that schools and hospitals were actually headquarters for Hamas or caches for weapons and for murderers. We discovered that this was in fact the truth, that the intelligence was in fact true, and still people can't connect the dots that the Palestinian people are complicitous in this. To me, I could be overstepping my bounds here. The Palestinian identity itself is a political identity. It allies itself with a certain ideology because you're talking about Syrians, Jordanians, and Egyptians, basically, who came to Israel because the Jews made the desert bloom and they drained the swamps and they killed malaria and they made technology happen. And for the better opportunities that brought to a world that was frankly impoverished and backwards in medieval. And they now identify as Palestinians, a unique set of people whose only uniqueness lies in the fact that they consider themselves a persecuted and oppressed minority.
Yeah, and in terms of them being complicit in October 7th, so again, when Hamas broke down parts of the fence, when people heard about it in Gaza, just civilians marched into Israel, took part in what Hamas was doing. Others, as we saw, were waiting, were celebrating, were waiting for the hostages. We know that many of the hostages were held by civilians. So this suffering. When Westerners talk about the suffering of the Palestinians as something we should care about, as something that is Israel's fault. Remember again the fact that we have educated generations of Palestinians with our tax dollars to want nothing but to murder Jews, and then put it in the context of this war. So let's say, people are saying, some people are saying, okay, Israel has a right to defend itself, but should avoid civilian casualties. Let's say Israel actually went, they're already doing that, but let's say they went even further, sacrificed even more of their own soldiers, more of their own goals of the war, and just went and pinpoint, found terrorists, found leaders of Hamas, found people who were involved in October 7th, and then left. What is Israel leaving behind? It is leaving behind the society that made it possible, the culture, the ideas that made this the good thing to do. Now, the suffering of Palestinians right now, the reason we're doing this episode and the reason it came up was on the reality show a few days ago. I said that the fact that Palestinians are suffering is a good thing. And that was controversial even on the panel itself. And so it's important for me to clarify what that means. I absolutely think the suffering of Palestinians is a good thing because the more they are suffering, the less of a chance there is that they will want to do this again and again until Israel is annihilated, as Hamas has promised. So, Mark, was I too extreme, as some might say, in saying the Palestinians, the suffering of the Palestinians is a good thing?
No, no. If you do terrible things, if you believe in ideology that's genocidal, and you act on that, you have to learn in no uncertain terms that that kind of action will only end in your oblivion, in your complete annihilation, so that you don't do it again, so that people in the future understand that that is a losing tactic. It's not going to get anywhere. It's going to end in total destruction. Look, we in the West have become rich and complacent enough to think empathy is a good in and of itself. But like any feeling for someone, it has to be earned. Empathy for those who are suffering for something that is not their own fault. For example, the 1,200 human beings who were ruthlessly murdered in those kibbutzes. That is appropriate empathy. Empathy for the murderer is a perversion of justice. It's a perverse form of love that I don't understand. The people who are suffering in Gaza now have brought this upon themselves. Frankly, I'm echoing your thought. It should be worse. It should be worse. There shouldn't be a single IDF soldier dying over there. The fact that they're going through urban warfare at the moment, the most difficult kind of warfare there is, going through miles and miles and miles of tunnels to search out this vermin is extremely risky to them. And it's a sacrifice, to be honest with you, of those soldiers in the face of this horrible vermin. They should just they should just have bombed them into submission, completely annihilated them into submission. Now, and I'm going to get a lot of blowback from that, but that's just the way it is. If you value the soldiers who are standing for democracy, for liberty, for the pillars of Western civilization, versus those who are standing for a medievalist, fanatical, nationalistic, murderous ideology, you should value the people who are standing for the good stuff.
Yeah, and the alternative to sacrificing soldiers would be causing more suffering to Palestinians in the attempt to kill Hamas and destroy their ability to kill Jews. And it would send a message to the places where Israel isn't yet acting, which is you have a chance to avoid this happening. You need to fight Hamas, and you need to realize that Israel will not spare you if Hamas is hiding behind you. So think twice before.
Not only Israel, but the United States shouldn't spare these people. And I use that term people loosely because if you believe that murdering people is a justifiable way of getting what you want, if you think that subjugation and dominance is a decent moral premise to work from, you're not a person to me. People treat others with respect. They understand that they are sovereign beings, and that if they want them to come over to their side of thinking, they need to persuade them, not use a knife, cut off their head, rape them, pillage their homes. That is the lack of civilization. You have left civilization behind us, precisely what the Palestinian people did when they cheered on this mass murder that happened. You left civilization behind. You said, I don't want to negotiate anymore. Fine. Now the only way you can come to the negotiating table is when you unequivocally denounce your philosophy and never pursue it again in the future.
One of the I think most symbolic parts of what October 7th was the attack on the music festival. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Nova, where they show it's a documentary. They show videos from that festival and from before, and it is the kind of thing that these people would attack because it's people having fun, people enjoying music, enjoying a night out, have just, living life. Living life is what Palestinians don't want Jews to do and are willing to die in order to prevent Jews from doing. I want to compare this to a few other things, but let's quickly go to the super chats. Thank you, Phil, for the super chat. Phil says, one, goal, live in freedom. Two, plan to achieve goal, remove by available means that which prevents. That which prevents one. If in doubt, refer to two. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Jonathan Honig, for the super chat. Jonathan says, congrats to ARCUK on tremendous growth and thanks for your clear moral perspective during this crisis. Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Johnny. And thank you, Phil, for another super chat. Phil says, as a Stones fan, I can't help thinking that sympathy for the devil, the lyric, understand the nature of my game, could be an Islamist tune. Are they allowed to enjoy music? I don't know. But anyway, I will have an expert on Islam to discuss that. Um, you know, we've compared this current war and the way the West looks at it to different times in history. And again, in World War II, would anybody have said in Britain, look, we can't cause this suffering to the Nazis or to the German people who are somehow completely separate from the Nazis if we're going to follow today's logic and apply it to back then. We can't cause the Japanese suffering. All they did was kill a few thousand people in Pearl Harbor. Why do they deserve to suffer? What do you think of the way we look at wars today compared to the way we look at it in the past? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the good news is that far less people die in these wars. The bad news is The conflicts are perennial. They never go away. We've been in more or less consistent war since 2001 because we failed to identify who the enemy was. We failed to go after the real perpetrators of these crimes against humanity. And likewise, if we had failed to do that in World War II, we'd still have Japanese imperialism as our friend. They'd still be raping China. They'd probably have extended their reach into every part of Malaysia. Hitler would still be around. He probably would have passed the cloak on to some other disgusting Nazi, and they would have been, at least in Germany, but still a metastasizing presence in the world. Instead, we understood that the people were at war with us. They were participating in the war effort, and that they participated in the war effort because they predominantly bought into an ideology that was nationalistic, murderous, in its premises. And we brought them to a state of unconditional surrender. And then in Japan, we made MacArthur, the general in that theater, the military governor of Japan, and forced constitutional norms down their fucking throats. And you know what? That they were better for it, and they're our friends, and now we trade with one another. And if there were an objectivist in office, we'd openly trade with them instead of these ridiculous tariffs and prohibitions that our government, nationalistic government, puts on people. So yes, it's possible for an entire population to be if infected with a pathotypical virus of their thinking. And that's exactly what happened in World War II with the Nazis and with the imperialistic Japanese, even with the Soviets. Communism is a pathotypical form of reasoning and thinking and looking at the world that leads to violence. And in here we have Islamicism with pan-Arab joined with pan-Arab nationalism. It is a pathological way of looking at the world. It inspires violence. It's inherently anti-West, and what I mean by West is the best in the West. It's inherently anti-liberty. It's inherently anti-sovereignty. It's inherently anti-peace. It's always going to inspire war. And it's time that we settle the score. Or we'll just be content with dealing with characters like Hamas forever. And I don't wish that upon anybody. I don't wish that upon the Palestinian people. The few in the Palestinian territories there who don't want to be subjected to this kind of ideology, and there probably are a few. They deserve a better life. And my empathy is for them because they're trapped and they can't get out.
So, I look at the people who care about the suffering of so-called innocents and so on, and I want to think maybe it comes from a good place. So, these protests, these anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, or just ceasefire protests, uh, those are people who don't want innocents to suffer and be targeted, right? Well, we
No.
have a video that
Oh, okay.
that challenges that assumption, Daniel.
Another ship around. Yemen, Yemen, make us proud. Yemen, Yemen, make us proud. Turn another ship around. Turn another ship around.
All
Where
right.
was that? Was that in New York?
Was that? I'm not sure. They had that. This was. Yeah, it looks like New York. Yeah, it's the UN building. Yeah, they had the same chant in London as well. For people who couldn't hear, that's Yemen, Yemen, make us proud. Turn another ship around. That's Yemen. That's the Houthis in Yemen. Attacking ships that are coming to those people in part. That's goods that you are using. So it's one of those magical combinations of stupid and evil. I don't like it when we refer to people who are wrong as stupid because it lets them off the hook. But in this case, you have to wonder.
Well,
Yeah.
look, I mean, evil is always self-destructive, always self-destructive. It's not surprising to me that these people are chanting, basically their own demise, because they're evil. Yes, and I can say that. I can say that, and you can say that out there watching us with complete uh, moral clarity. They are evil. What they are advocating for is evil. And I wish, and more people need to call them on it so that they don't stand out there in the New York cold thinking they're actually right.
So regarding, specifically between Israel and Hamas, are people there kind of against the idea of targeting innocents? So Daniel, if you have that tweet, we've spoken about Novara Media in on this channel. This is a somewhat prominent news outlet in the UK that advocates for something they call fully automated luxury communism. If you can put that on the full screen just for a few seconds so that people can read it, but I'll read it out as well. So this is Rivka Brown from tweeting on October 7th, saying today should be a day of celebration for supporters of democracy and human rights worldwide as Gazans break out of their open-air prison and Hamas fighters cross into their colonizers' territory. The struggle for freedom is rarely bloodless, and we shouldn't apologize for it. So this is a day of celebration. This was tweeted out while Jews were being slaughtered. By the way, this woman is of Jewish descent. While Jews were being slaughtered by those savages, while women were being raped. This is a feminist news outlet, but that doesn't really apply, as we've recently discovered, to Jewish women. While really the most horrific things that have ever been seen visually, in such a widespread manner. And this is what, and by the way, the clips, Hamas was live streaming themselves. This was all over the internet as it was happening. And this woman no doubt saw that. And yet, this is what she tweeted. Of course, later, not of course, but later Novara Media had her remove that tweet, and they're
Did they
still.
remove her? Did they remove her from her
No,
job?
of course not. I mean, I doubt anybody there actually disagrees with the tweet. They just don't think it's a good idea to say it publicly. Because if you look at what they say publicly, it's kind of some variation of that. It's, the people who started calling for a ceasefire as soon as Hamas was done. Basically, that's who Novara Media is.
There's there's a few catchphrases and words that these people latch onto that enables them to turn off their brain and their moral compass. And one of the catchphrases is open air prison. Okay, they latch onto that. They don't ask themselves whether it's true or not, but if somebody shows them a picture of a fence and barbed wire, it must be true. Apartheid state is another one they love to use. Turn off brain, turn off moral compass, turn off curiosity, latch onto that because apartheid states suck, and then protest apartheid state. Genocide is another one that obliterates fact, obliterates all fact. Of course, you have to be against genocide, for crying out loud, but is a genocide actually being committed in the Palestinian areas? Is it really? Has it? I mean, this is something they've been screaming for decades. As the Palestinian population probably outpaced the Jewish population in growth. And then when you point this little factoid out, of course, it means nothing. They pivot to another catchphrase that can enable them to turn off their moral compass and their brain and pursue their course of self-destruction with total righteousness. I hate these people.
Speaking of these people and genocide, tomorrow's episode of the Daily Objective, we're going to talk about our old pal Cenk Uygur, and we're going to talk about a few of the debates he's done recently. And one of them, I saw the first few seconds of it, and it was him and Destiny, and he was asked, "Is Israel committing a genocide?" And he starts with, "It depends on how you define genocide." Yes, of course it is. I could say that I could say Cenk is committing genocide at breakfast every morning. It depends on how I define genocide. That is always the case with everything. It depends on how you define the term.
Now Destiny's supposed to be a pretty savvy person. Did he call him on that?
I will have to watch more than 10 seconds of that video to know, and I plan to do that before tomorrow's show. So
Good.
Daniel says yes, he did. Uh, I want to quickly thank a few more super chatters. Thanks again, Phil. Phil says a recognition of reason would be for Israel to say, I'm gonna guess this acronym is fuck you to the UN and just leave. PS sympathy should be an Islamist theme tune, Razi. I don't remember what I said, but I accept the correction. Thank you, Stephen, for the super chat. Thank you, Smani, for the super chat. You know, uh, another thing with looking historically at how wars are fought and what ends up actually resulting in real peace is that real peace comes from a war being ending decisively. So Israel has fought its wars against its Arab neighbors several times. The peace deals that it has with Egypt and Jordan were in part a product of Egypt and Jordan realizing they can't defeat Israel militarily. Now, I think those wars as well could have gone better. I also would not sign a peace deal with these countries, but that's a story for a different day. With the Palestinians, Israel is never decisive. It gets less and less decisive with each conflict. Now, this is a bit more than previous ones because the attack was much worse, but it's still very apologetic. It's limited to Gaza. There are still attacks coming from the West Bank, and Israel does the pinpoint actions they did before because they are not going to act fully until something like October 7th comes from the West Bank. And the same goes with the battles at the north with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is attacking. Israel is responding a little bit. They know a big attack is coming, and they're leaving it for the enemy to do it on their terms. So, yeah, when we talk about the suffering of Palestinians and the suffering of people in South Lebanon, the reason that is a good thing is because it's the only way that any actual peace at any point in the future could happen. If a side realizes there is nothing worse for them than attempting to kill people on the other side.
So can I just say I mean, there's lots of moral differences, but the moral difference between a person put in this position by the enemy is that they don't like or relish having to do what they have to do. Nobody who has a normal, I mean, as in non-pathological way of looking at the world, enjoys hurting other people. But oftentimes, bad folks put you in the position that gives you no choice. And in this conflict, we have a war of ideologies. We have a forward-looking, progressive, liberal ideology. I'm leaving out the flaws of Israel because they're immaterial at this point. We know what Israel basically stands for, versus a medievalist, religiously fanatical, nationalistic ideology that holds violence as a means of acquiring values. Now, there can be no compromise between those two. It's either one or the other. Because to compromise to the other gives you what we've seen for the past 20, 30 years, since the beginning of Israel, which is never-ending violence. So you people who are calling for a ceasefire, remember that that's what you are calling for, never-ending violence. And until you cut out this metastasizing tumor, that's what you will get, and that's what you are for. And so think about that. I hope it serves as a mirror to your conscience.
Thank you, Cargo Crew, for the super chat. I want to also point out, in recent days, we've heard criticism of Netanyahu from world leaders. Now, nobody enjoys criticizing Netanyahu more than me, but this is the one thing that I like. Well, I like his rhetoric. I just don't like his actions. And it's his rhetoric that's being criticized. We saw that Britain's foreign secretary said he is disappointed with Netanyahu's position on the two-state solution. Biden has said similar things.
Oh my God.
There's something to the West talking about this, even if you actually think that is the right way to go, which of course I don't. But even if you think that is the right way to go, there's the timing of it. If you are now pushing for a two-state solution, you are pushing for more terrorism everywhere in the world. You are saying to terrorists, this kind of stuff, what we saw on October 7th works. If your goal is some sort of concessions on the part of the West, kill innocents, attack people in music festivals, commit the worst atrocities, and you will get what it is you're after. Oddly enough, we don't hear much criticism of Hamas despite them being, very clear on the fact that they're against a two-state solution, we hear this criticism of Israel, and instead of the West criticizing Israel for not doing what the West did to Japan and Germany, and not causing more suffering on the Palestinian side, so that Palestinians look towards a different way of life. Yeah, what we are doing is guaranteeing future wars
I
and
mean,
future suffering.
this is the result of this perverse moral system that people have with their oppression hierarchies. If you're at the top of the hierarchy, you've gotten there by means that are nefarious, and the people at the bottom have a right to do anything they want to you. And that's why Hamas and the Palestinian people are getting a pass, because of this bizarre woke framing of the world combined with altruism, and the people and the rich, happy Israelis are being put at the bottom of the pyramid in their minds and have no right to their lives or to their happiness. So we have to be, at least we are participating in the right kind of dialogue, which is pushing our moral framework in the other direction. Because frankly, the pundits that rule the world right now, the people who are making the statements that I think are morally supporting Hamas, are a confederacy of dunces. Dump them.
Thank you, Kathleen, for the super chat. Thank you, Phil, for another super chat. Phil says, recognize that terrorist organizations automatically attract psychopaths. Um, one newspaper that we often talk about and was the topic of yesterday's episode of the Daily Objective is The Guardian. The Guardian, as you know, Mark, says the darndest things, and that used to be a segment on the reality show. It is no longer a segment, but it is the episode of today's episode of the reality show Extra, which starts right after we go off the air here. That is for YouTube members. So if you're not a member, you can click become a member on YouTube right now. If you are a member of ARCUK but not YouTube, you have access to the Zoom link. Tomorrow, we'll talk about another person who says the darndest things, Cenk Uygur. And we are also going to ask that's on the Daily Objective. And on the reality show, we will ask why civilized people support savages. And Mark, you and I are going to be on that show with Don Watkins as well, who is actually the person who kind of inspired the reality show. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But yeah, the reality show Extra starts right now. So thank you for joining me, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if you see value in this content, consider liking it, sharing it, commenting. It helps with the algorithm. People need to hear this. They don't hear this in even most pro-Israel outlets. So yeah, let's let people reconsider the way they're thinking about the war. Thanks, Mark.